The moment you reach for your phone, you already know you are doing it again. Not because you need something, not because anyone important just called, not because there is a real emergency waiting behind the glass. You reach for it because there is a tiny pocket of silence in front of you, and silence has started to feel unbearable. You were supposed to begin. The tab is open. The document is ready. The book is beside you. The decision was made last night in a brief flash of honesty when you said tomorrow will be different. But now tomorrow is here, and your hand moves before your values do. A quick check, you tell yourself. Just a second. Just enough to soften the friction of starting. One notification becomes three. Three become a drift. A drift becomes a mood. Then the mood becomes the day. Hours later, nothing is technically wrong, and yet something essential has gone missing. The strangest part is that you still care. You care enough to feel guilty. You care enough to imagine a better version of yourself with almost painful clarity. But caring is no longer enough to move you. That is the beginning of the trap. Not failure, not laziness, not weakness. The trap is when your attention stops obeying your intentions. Most people blame themselves too early. They think the problem is character, that somewhere deep inside they are missing the discipline gene other people got. They watch someone else wake up early, train hard, focus for hours, build a business, write a book, keep promises, and they turn those actions into evidence against themselves. Look at them, look at me. They must want it more. They must be stronger. They must be built differently. But a great deal of modern suffering comes from misunderstanding the battlefield. You think you are fighting a motivation problem when you are really fighting an environment problem, a stimulation problem, and an identity problem all tangled together. You are trying to generate steady attention in a world that profits from your fragmentation. You are trying to value long-term meaning while surrounded by systems designed to reward instant reaction. You are trying to feel satisfied by real life after training your nervous system to expect novelty every 30 seconds. That does not mean you are powerless. It means you need honesty before strategy. If you misdiagnose the wound, every cure feels fake. There was a time when boredom was an ordinary condition. People still disliked it, but they knew how to survive it. They stood in line and simply stood in line. They sat on buses and stared out the window. They waited for water to boil and listened to the room. A conversation with a friend was not competing with 20 other people, 7 apps, and a stream of algorithmic seduction. Solitude was not always pleasant, but it was available, and in that availability something important could happen. The mind could settle. Thoughts could connect. Feelings that had been pushed aside could finally rise and be understood. Desire could mature from impulse into intention. Now look at the average day. The moment there is a pause, it gets filled. Wake up, check. Bathroom, check. Breakfast, check. Work break, check. Elevator, check. Waiting, check. Bed, check. Waiting, bed, check. Microdose after microdose of stimulation, each one small enough to feel harmless, together large enough to reshape the rhythm of your inner life. By the end of the day, you are not just tired, you are thinned out. Your mind is full of activity and empty of depth. That thinning has consequences. It changes what ordinary effort feels like. A quiet task that once would have felt neutral now feels strangely abrasive. Reading a few pages is hard. Writing one honest paragraph feels like dragging furniture through mud. Starting a workout feels insulting. Cleaning the room feels emotionally loaded for no rational reason. You begin to interpret that resistance as a message about the task itself or about your own inadequacy. Maybe I am just not meant for this. Maybe I need to find my passion. Maybe I am too burned out. Maybe I need the right routine, the right notebook, the right playlist, the right morning, the right level of inspiration. Sometimes those things help at the margins, but often they become respectable ways to avoid the truth. The truth is simpler and less flattering to the modern world. You have trained your brain to expect high reward for low effort, and now normal effort feels like deprivation. Not impossible, just unfamiliar and under-rewarded. This is why procrastination is so often misunderstood. People talk about it as if it were a scheduling defect, a time management issue, a habit of delay. But procrastination is usually an emotional negotiation disguised as a calendar problem. You are not merely postponing work. You are postponing discomfort. You are postponing uncertainty, imperfection, ego risk, frustration, confusion, and the quiet fear that trying seriously will expose something you do not want to see. Stimulation becomes your anesthetic. You do not need to solve the emotional problem if you can interrupt the feeling fast enough. Scroll, click, snack, refresh, watch, search, rearrange, consume something that makes you feel active without requiring commitment. The relief is real, which is why the habit is so sticky. But relief is not resolution. Every time you escape the friction of beginning, you teach yourself that friction is dangerous. Every time you dodge the unease of focused effort, you make focused effort more threatening tomorrow. At first, this pattern feels like a productivity issue. Then it becomes something deeper. It starts affecting self-respect, because the most painful promises are not the ones other people break. They are the ones you keep breaking with yourself. You say you will wake up and begin, and you do not. You say this week you will get serious, and you drift. You say no more mindless scrolling before bed, and your face is lit by the same cold light at 1 in the morning. Over time, the damage is not only external, it is internal. You stop trusting your own declarations. You become suspicious of your own enthusiasm. When you feel inspired, part of you rolls its eyes because it has seen this movie before. The result is a peculiar kind of despair, not dramatic enough to look like a collapse, but corrosive enough to quietly weaken everything. You still dream, you still imagine, you still want. But your relationship with your own word becomes unstable, and once that instability sets in, even good advice starts sounding naive. This is one reason people become obsessed with motivation. They think what they need is a bigger emotional spark, a more intense speech, a stronger rush, a reason so compelling that effort will stop hurting. But motivation is a terrible foundation for recovery because it is itself a stimulating state. It gives you the feeling of movement before movement has actually occurred. You watch a video, hear the truth, feel the surge, maybe even make a list, and the list becomes a stand-in for the life. Planning starts feeling almost as satisfying as doing. Declaring begins to replace building. Then the emotional charge fades, and because no real systems were created, you fall back into the same groove. This is why some people are permanently inspired and permanently inspired and permanently unchanged. They are using intensity as entertainment. They do not need another spark. They need a lower threshold for boring action. The phrase dopamine detox became popular because it gave people a language for what they could feel but could not fully explain. Their brains felt hijacked. Their attention span felt broken. Their days were full, but their lives were not moving. The phrase is imperfect. People sometimes use it too loosely, as if dopamine were simply bad, as if all pleasure were sabotage, as if the goal were to become a joyless machine. That misses the point. The real issue is not pleasure. The real issue is mismatch. When your reward system is conditioned by constant novelty, fast stimulation, and endless options, slower forms of meaning struggle to compete. Life begins to lose texture. A walk seems dull. A single page seems too small. A conversation seems insufficient unless you are half distracted. Work that matters feels barren before it begins. The issue is not that you enjoy things. The issue is that too much artificial intensity makes normal reality feel underlit. Once that happens, you start demanding that life perform for you. Every task must feel aligned, exciting, validated, optimized, and emotionally smooth. But meaningful work rarely arrives like that. Most worthy things begin in modesty. A sentence, a page, 10 minutes, a small refusal, a return, a repetition. If your nervous system only responds to peaks, you will keep abandoning the very activities that could save you. This is where many people lose years, not because they never had ideas, but because they developed an addiction to feeling ready. They waited for certainty, for energy, for emotional clarity, for the perfect day to begin becoming the person they admired. Meanwhile, the people who looked disciplined from the outside were often doing something much less glamorous. They were beginning in states that felt incomplete. They were working before the mood arrived. They were allowing the first minutes to be awkward. They were building tolerance for low stimulation effort. In other words, they were retraining attention. Retraining attention sounds technical, but it is deeply human. It begins with recognizing that your mind is not a courtroom where every feeling deserves a vote. If you wait to act until your inner world gives unanimous consent, you will spend an astonishing amount of time in limbo. One part of you wants the future. Another part wants ease. One part wants growth. Another wants comfort. One part knows that the phone is making you miserable. Another part wants one more hit because it cannot stand the emptiness beneath the craving. If you identify with every impulse equally, you become the servant of whatever feeling is loudest in the moment. Maturity is not the absence of conflicting impulses, it is the ability to place them in order. The self who wants a meaningful life must become more than a weekend fantasy. It must become the voice you trust enough to obey before results appear. To do that, you need a new understanding of discomfort. Right now, discomfort probably feels like a stop sign. You sit down to begin and suddenly feel restless, foggy, annoyed, unfocused, maybe even sleepy. Those sensations seem to prove that something is wrong, but often they are not evidence of incapacity. They are withdrawal symptoms from overstimulation meeting the first honest demand of attention. The moment you try to do one thing for an extended stretch, all the habits that trained you for fragmentation protest. This is not failure, this is exposure. You are seeing the true condition of your attention when it is no longer flooded with easy reward. Most people panic at this stage because they interpret the first wave of resistance as a reason to quit. But the first wave tells you almost nothing except that your mind has been living on sugar and is surprised by water. Think about how many invisible cues now govern your days. The buzz, the red dot, the autoplay, the recommendation, the open tab, the half-finished conversation, the endless stored possibility of something more interesting happening elsewhere. You are not just reacting to content, you are reacting to potential. Maybe there is a message, maybe there is news, maybe there is a better idea. Maybe there is proof that other people are moving faster. Maybe there is a shortcut you have not found yet. This creates a chronic state of cognitive leaning, as if your mind is always tilted toward the next thing. A person in that state can look calm on the outside and still feel internally scattered. They sit at the desk, but some part of them remains elsewhere, anticipating interruption. They are physically present and psychologically divided. That division is exhausting. It also kills depth, because depth requires a temporary closing of doors. You must be willing for a little while to let almost everything else remain unanswered. Many people say they want focus, but what they really want is focused results without the temporary grief of exclusion. They want to write without not checking their messages. They want to read without missing the internet. They want to work deeply without feeling cut off from stimulation. But attention has a cost. To give yourself fully to one thing, You must not give yourself to many others during that same window. That sounds obvious until you feel it emotionally. The fear arrives as a whisper. What if I miss something? What if I get bored? What if this is not the best use of my time? What if I commit and then discover I chose wrong? So you preserve optionality. You keep everything slightly open. You maintain access to interruption. You call it flexibility, but often it is fear wearing a smart outfit. And the price of that fear is a life made of fragments. A fragmented life is difficult to enjoy because enjoyment requires contact. To enjoy a conversation, you must really be in it. To enjoy a meal, you must taste it instead of accompanying it with noise. To enjoy progress, you must witness the slow accumulation of effort rather than demand constant dramatic breakthroughs. When stimulation is excessive, contact weakens. You move through experience with one eye half turned toward the exit. This is why some people can spend an entire weekend supposedly resting and emerge more depleted than before. They were not resting, they were consuming. Consumption can feel like rest because it is passive. But passive is not the same as restorative. Real restoration often looks less exciting. Sleep, a walk, a long talk, finishing one thing, sitting without reaching, letting the nervous system stop performing. That kind of restoration is harder to market and harder to crave in an addicted state, but it is the kind that gives life back. The trap deepens when you begin confusing your current capacity with your permanent identity. You have a few bad months of distraction and say, I am just not disciplined. You struggle to read and say, I am not a reader anymore. You fail to keep a routine and say, I am too inconsistent. The mind loves to turn temporary patterns into definitions because definitions feel stable, and stability feels safer than uncertainty. But identity can imprison as easily as it can guide. If you call yourself lazy long enough, you start treating your own avoidance as inevitable. If you call yourself chaotic, you stop experimenting with order because failure seems pre-proven. If you call yourself an overthinker, you begin to protect overthinking as part of who you are. What began as a description hardens into permission. Then every repeated behavior appears to confirm the story, even though the story itself is helping create the behavior. A better question is not who am I, but what am I rehearsing? Rehearsal is powerful because it shifts the focus from essence to repetition. You may be rehearsing distraction, rehearsing escape, rehearsing delay, rehearsing quick comfort whenever effort feels uncertain, rehearsing self-contempt after avoidance instead of self-correction during it. The good news hidden inside this idea is that rehearsal can change. If a person can rehearse defeat, they can rehearse return. They can rehearse putting the phone down after one lapse instead of letting one lapse become a wasted day. They can rehearse beginning before they feel inspired. They can rehearse short periods of full attention. They can rehearse a clean evening. They can rehearse keeping a promise so small it almost looks unimpressive, then using that kept promise as proof that the identity is moving. Transformation is usually quieter than fantasy suggests. It is not one heroic performance. It is a change in what you practice until the new pattern stops feeling theatrical and starts feeling normal. This matters because shame is one of the strongest fuels of the dopamine trap. After a day of procrastination, the mind becomes cruel. You wasted time. You are behind. Other people are more serious. You always do this. You are pathetic. This inner violence feels strangely justified because you believe it is motivating. You think if you are harsh enough, maybe tomorrow you will snap into action. But shame usually increases the need for escape. If your inner world becomes hostile, of course you will look for numbness. Of course you will want relief. The phone, the snack, the video, the fantasy, the random browsing session, the pointless task suddenly serve a second function. They do not just distract you from work. They distract you from yourself. Then the cycle repeats, only now it has emotional gravity. You are not merely avoiding effort, you are medicating disappointment. Recovery becomes possible when you stop treating yourself like a failed machine and start treating yourself like a person who has been shaped by repetition and environment. That does not mean becoming soft in the useless sense. It means becoming accurate. Accuracy is compassionate because it names the real issue. If the issue is overstimulation, then part of the solution is reducing stimulation. If the issue is fear of imperfect effort, part of the solution is practicing visible imperfection. If the issue is unstable self-trust, part of the solution is making fewer promises and keeping them more consistently. If the issue is mental fragmentation, part of the solution is protecting periods of singular focus. Notice how different this is from waiting to feel like a better person. Better feelings may come later. Better structures must come first. One of the simplest and most difficult changes is learning to let urges pass without obeying them. That sounds like a small thing until you try it. An urge arrives and your body leans forward. Check the phone. Open the tab. Search the thing. Switch tasks. Make coffee even though you just made coffee. Reorganize the desk. Look for a better method. Text someone. Anything but continue. In the old pattern, the urge and the action are fused so tightly they feel like the same event. In a recovering mind, they begin to separate. You feel the impulse, and then you remain seated. You feel the itch, and you do not scratch immediately. You notice the wave rise, peak, and alter. This is not glamorous, but it is profound. Freedom is often just the widening of one small gap. The gap between wanting and doing. A life can change inside that gap. At first, you may discover something uncomfortable. Without constant stimulation, emotions you have been outrunning start to appear. You may feel sadness you did not label as sadness because it had been disguised as numbness. You may feel anger at time lost, regret about your own drift, loneliness, fear, an old sense of inadequacy, or grief for versions of yourself you delayed becoming. This is one reason distraction is so seductive. It is not just pleasant, it is protective. It shields you from the backlog of feeling you have not processed. But healing attention requires more than deleting apps or setting timers. It requires becoming a person who can survive contact with inner reality. Otherwise, the moment silence reveals something tender or painful, you will run again. A calmer life demands emotional courage, not just better tools. Imagine the opposite of the trap for a moment. Imagine waking up and not immediately surrendering your mind. Imagine the first minutes of your day belonging to you instead of to a feed. Imagine being able to sit with coffee, or sunlight, or quiet, without a frantic need to fill the space. Imagine starting work before negotiation begins. Imagine doing one task long enough to become absorbed in it. Imagine ending a day tired from real effort instead of tired from digital residue. Imagine feeling clean in your own attention. This vision matters because change is easier when it is not framed only as deprivation. If recovery sounds like the removal of everything pleasurable, rebellion is inevitable. But if recovery is framed as regaining depth, dignity, clarity, and self-command, then restraint stops feeling like punishment. It becomes an exchange. Less noise for more life. Still, there is a trap inside the idea of reclaiming your life. Many people hear it and immediately become extreme. They want to cut everything off, become perfectly disciplined overnight, transform the room, the schedule, the body, the mind, and the soul before next Monday. They make rules with the energy of revolution. No phone at all. 5 a.m. Wake up. 2 workouts a day. Deep work for 6 hours. 0 sugar. Cold showers. Full reset. Sometimes a dramatic break can be useful, especially when a pattern is severe. But more often, extremity is a disguised form of impatience. You are still chasing intensity, only now you are calling it discipline. And because the plan is disconnected from your actual capacity, the inevitable collapse feels like proof that change is impossible. In reality, the collapse proves only that fantasy still has too much influence. Sustainable self-respect is built with measured seriousness, not cinematic vows. Measured seriousness begins with making reality frictional in the right direction. If distraction is always one thumb movement away and focus requires 10 steps of preparation, your values are fighting downhill. Environment is not everything, but it is not a side issue. It matters where the phone sleeps. It matters whether your work begins on an uncluttered screen or a carnival. It matters whether your bed is associated with rest or endless scrolling. It matters whether the easiest evening path leads toward noise or toward sleep. People sometimes resist these ideas because they want total sovereignty. They want to be the kind of person who can master temptation in any setting. But the wiser question is not, can I resist this? But why am I making resistance harder than necessary? A strong person still benefits from a good doorway. Remove some of the obvious traps, not because you are weak, but because your attention is worth defending. The same principle applies to time. Vague intentions are stimulation's best friend. If your plan is simply to work more, read more, focus more, be disciplined, or use your phone less, the day will eat those intentions alive. General desire loses to specific distraction. But if you say from 8 until 8:30, I will sit with this one task, now you have something the mind can actually obey. Notice the scale. 30 minutes, not a life sentence. A small, defined container does two things at once. It reduces the emotional drama of beginning, and it creates a measurable act of self-trust. You are no longer demanding that your future self become superhuman. You are asking your present self to remain in one place long enough to prove that attention can be trained. When people talk about discipline, they often imagine hardness. In practice, discipline is frequently precision. Precision also means being honest about transitions. Many people lose their day not during the work itself, but during the handoff between states, waking to working, working to break, break to working again, evening to sleep. The mind is vulnerable in these passages because no clear identity is active. You are between selves. If no intentional bridge exists, habit takes over. That is why one innocent check in the morning becomes 40 minutes, why one 5-minute break becomes a full drift, why one episode becomes a midnight blur. The trap thrives in ambiguity. So ask yourself where your day tends to leak, not in theory, but in lived detail. Which doorways repeatedly lead to mindless consumption? Which moments repeatedly invite avoidance? Which emotional states make you easiest to hijack? Tiredness, frustration, loneliness, uncertainty. Those are not just moods, they are conditions in which old patterns come hunting. There is another subtle cost of overstimulation that people rarely name. It shrinks gratitude. Not because you become a bad person, but because comparison and novelty corrode appreciation. When your mind is constantly exposed to curated lives, endless options, and rapidly changing emotional triggers, ordinary blessings stop registering. A clean room, a working body, a quiet evening, a good conversation, a single finished task, a stable relationship, a chance to improve. Slowly these are riches that require presence to be felt. A distracted mind lives one step ahead of itself. It does not digest what is already here. It is always glancing sideways at what might be better, louder, funnier, sexier, faster, or more validating. Gratitude is not moral decoration. It is stabilizing perception. Without it, your life can improve and still feel strangely insufficient. And insufficiency is fuel for more stimulation. If this moment feels lacking, perhaps the next input will fix it. If this task feels flat, perhaps a different one will be more rewarding. If this conversation pauses, perhaps the phone will provide a better hit. The search becomes habitual. Soon, you are not living according to deep preference, but according to a series of tiny escapes from mild dissatisfaction. This is how people become strangers to their own values. Not all at once. Gradually. Quietly. One preference at a time. Please stop asking what kind of life feels true and start asking what will relieve this second. Of course the second matters. But a life built from constant relief-seeking tends to become shallow because truth often asks you to endure a little friction on the way to contact. Contact is the word to remember. Contact with work. Contact with thought. Contact with grief. Contact with desire. Contact with another human being. Contact with your own capacity. The dopamine trap breaks contact by training constant substitution. Before you fully feel one thing, another stimulus arrives. Before a thought can ripen, you replace it. Before discomfort teaches you something, you sedate it. Before work turns difficult and then rewarding, you abandon it. This creates a false sense of movement because your days are packed with transitions. But transitions are not the same as progress. You can move between 20 activities and still remain existentially still. Real movement often looks slower from the outside because it involves staying. Staying with the page. Staying with the uncertainty. Staying with the uncertainty. Staying with the sentence until it says what it means. Staying with the run until the body settles. Staying with the silence until your own mind becomes audible again. You may wonder why some people can handle high stimulation better than others. Part of it is temperament. Part is age. Part is environment. Part is the stage of life they are in. But a major factor is whether they have maintained islands of non-reactive attention. A person may use technology constantly and still remain grounded if they preserve pockets of depth, boundaries of sleep, meaningful work, real relationships, and some ability to be alone without panic. Another person may use the same tools and be slowly hollowed out because every vulnerable moment is met with consumption. The issue is not purity. The issue is ratio. What percentage of your life is lived in direct contact with reality, and what percentage is mediated through stimulation designed to keep you there? Ask the question gently, but ask it honestly. One of the most liberating realizations is that your brain does not need to love the right thing immediately for the right thing to become easier. People wait for healthy behavior to feel natural before they trust it, but natural often just means familiar. If chaos has been familiar, order will feel strange at first. If constant input has been familiar, quiet will feel empty. If last-minute pressure has been familiar, steady effort will feel dull. If self-betrayal has been familiar, consistency will feel almost suspicious. Do not confuse strangeness with wrongness. Much of growth feels awkward precisely because it contradicts the pattern that shaped you. The first week of protecting attention can feel strangely colorless, not because life is becoming worse, but because your reward system has not recalibrated. What used to be overstimulating is gone, and what remains has not yet regained its depth. This middle period is where many people quit. They interpret recalibration as loss. It is actually recovery in progress. Consider how often you say you are tired when what you really mean is mentally overfed and spiritually undernourished. Physical exhaustion is real, and modern life can certainly produce it. But there is another kind of fatigue that comes from too much input and too little meaning. You take in information all day and somehow feel less clear. You consume entertainment and somehow feel less alive. You spend hours jumping between fragments and somehow feel unable to start one actual thing. That exhaustion is not always asking for more rest in the usual sense. Sometimes it is asking for fewer open loops, fewer impulses, fewer choices, fewer artificial highs, fewer half-commitments. The nervous system gets tired not only from effort, but from perpetual switching. Attention is expensive. Every redirect costs something. By night, the bill arrives. Burnout is often described as having done too much. Sometimes that is true. But many people are not burned out from meaningful work. They are burned out from the emotional drag of resisting meaningful work while drowning in low-quality stimulation. There is a special fatigue that comes from spending all day almost doing something important. The mind remains activated because the task exists, but the body never receives the clean relief of completion. Guilt accumulates. Open loops multiply. You are carrying the weight of your own avoidance, plus the residue of everything you used to avoid it. No wonder you feel tired. This is why a person can spend an entire day in distraction and still feel as if they ran a marathon. Internal conflict is labor. Fragmentation is labor. Self-reproach is labor. None of it moves you forward, but all of it drains you. There is an answer hidden in that pain. The answer is not harsher self-hatred. It is cleaner effort. When you complete something real, even something modest, you experience a different kind of tiredness. It has dignity. The body may be weary, but the mind is less haunted. A room cleaned, a page written, a workout finished, an email answered, a walk taken, a plan kept. These acts reintroduce coherence. They close loops instead of multiplying them. They restore proportion. One reason disciplined people often seem calmer is not because they are emotionally simpler. It is because they resolve more of the friction they create. They do not carry as many ghost tasks through the day. Their attention is not perfect, but it is less haunted by the unfinished. To rebuild that coherence, you need a relationship with beginning, not heroic beginning, humble beginning. The kind that does not wait for the perfect mood. Sit down, open the page, read one paragraph, write 3 honest sentences, put your shoes on, wash one plate, set a timer. Breathe once and stay. The ego hates small beginnings because they do not feel impressive enough to count, but the nervous system responds beautifully to them because they lower the threat of action. The goal of a small beginning is not to trick yourself forever. It is to get past the threshold where resistance is strongest. Once movement starts, a different part of you wakes up. The part that remembers effort is survivable. The part that enjoys immersion. The part that feels relief when life stops being theoretical and becomes concrete again. Notice something important here. None of this requires becoming an anti-pleasure monk. You do not need to hate technology, joy, play, or entertainment. You do not need to romanticize suffering. You do not need to turn life into a punishment chamber just because your attention has been compromised. In fact, the harsher and more self-righteous your recovery becomes, the more likely you are to rebel against it. The real aim is not dryness, it is sovereignty. Can you choose instead of compulsively react? Can you enjoy without becoming captured? Can you rest without dissolving? Can you use stimulation without letting stimulation use you? Those are wiser questions than whether a thing is inherently good or bad. Almost anything can become a problem when it becomes your first answer to every discomfort. There is also a social dimension to the trap. Attention is contagious, so is distraction. If everyone around you is constantly checking, scrolling, half-listening, multitasking, and treating interruption as normal, it becomes harder to even remember what full presence feels like. You adapt to the standard around you. A meal with no phones can feel intimate almost to the point of discomfort because it is so unusual. A conversation uninterrupted by glances at screens can feel startlingly deep. Reading for an hour without checking anything can feel ancient. This should tell you something. The standard has shifted. Many behaviors now considered normal would once have looked like chronic restlessness. If you want a deeper life, you may have to tolerate seeming slightly unusual to people who have made fragmentation their baseline. Being unusual in that way has rewards no algorithm can sell you. You become easier to trust because you are actually here. Your thoughts grow longer. Your speech becomes less jittery. You hear nuances in people because you are not mentally rehearsing your next distraction. You work with more continuity, which means your efforts start compounding instead of constantly restarting. Your evenings feel less like a blur. Your sleep deepens because your nervous system is not being whipped until the final minute. Slowly, the world regains edges. Food tastes stronger. Music lands deeper. Silence stops feeling like a threat. Longing becomes clearer because it is no longer buried under relentless input. This is not a fantasy of perfect serenity. It is a practical shift in what your days feel like from the inside. The deeper issue underneath distraction is often a fear of stillness. Stillness has a way of exposing what noise hides. Maybe you are grieving how much time you have wasted. Maybe you know you are living beneath your abilities. Maybe you suspect that the life you have arranged around convenience is making you smaller. Maybe you are lonely in a way that entertainment cannot touch. Maybe you have been chasing productivity when what you actually need is honesty. Stillness can reveal all of this, and revelation is inconvenient. So you keep moving, keep checking, keep consuming, keep decorating your delay with sophisticated language, research, optimization. Staying informed, looking for inspiration, but beneath the vocabulary, there may simply be avoidance of contact with the one person you cannot outrun forever, yourself. The beautiful thing is that the self waiting underneath the noise is often less monstrous than you fear. Yes, there may be regret. Yes, there may be grief. Yes, there may be untidy emotions and unresolved questions. But there is also intelligence there, and longing and instinct, and a kind of quiet honesty that only appears when stimulation loosens its grip. Many people think silence will destroy them, then discover that silence is where their real life begins speaking again. They remember what they care about. They remember which goals were borrowed and which were authentic. They remember that exhaustion is not a personality. They remember that they do not actually want to live as a scattered reaction to other people's priorities. In this way, reducing noise is not only about productivity. It is about recovering authorship. Authorship means you stop waiting for the day to tell you who you are. You decide in advance how certain moments will be met. Morning will not begin with surrender. Work will not begin with negotiation. Frustration will not automatically lead to escape. Evenings will not be given away by default. These are simple decisions, but simplicity does not make them easy. In fact, they are difficult precisely because they challenge identity at the level of habit. For a while, every new choice can feel like a small act of betrayal against your old self. The old self wants the old relief. The old self knows the old routes. The old self believes you will come back. This is why recovery often feels emotionally dramatic, even when the behaviors are modest. You are not merely changing actions. You are changing who gets the final say. One day, if you persist, an unexpected thing happens. The very activities that once felt dull start becoming satisfying again. Reading 2 pages becomes reading 20. A work session becomes a rhythm. A walk becomes a place where your mind clears instead of a chore you must decorate with content. A conversation becomes enough on its own. You start noticing that your cravings are less sharp, your thoughts less noisy, your urge to constantly check less commanding. Ordinary life develops flavor again. This is one of the clearest signs that your reward system is recalibrating. Depth, once buried under spectacle, becomes available. The tragedy is that many people give up just before this return happens. They stay loyal to the habit because the first stretch of recovery feels too plain. But plainness is not emptiness. Sometimes plainness is merely the absence of artificial fireworks, so your senses can relearn reality. There will still be bad days. There will be relapses. There will be evenings when you disappear into the feed, mornings when you begin with avoidance, afternoons when your mind feels like a room full of open doors and wind. Do not build an identity around those moments. Build a response. Shorten the recovery time. If you lose an hour, do not donate the rest of the day. If you break one boundary, do not break all of them. If you numb yourself tonight, do not turn tomorrow into a referendum on your worth. People who change are not people who never slip. They are people who return faster and with less drama. They learn the skill of interruption. They notice the old pattern early enough to step out before it becomes an entire week. In this sense, resilience is less about strength than about speed of return. Speed of return improves when your standards become clear and humane at the same time. Clear means you do not negotiate with yourself using vague language. Humane means you do not treat every failure as a moral catastrophe. Between those two lies real accountability. You knew the boundary. You crossed it. Fine. Return. You planned the work. You avoided it. Fine. Begin now. You wasted the morning. Fine. Begin now. You wasted the morning. Fine. Protect the afternoon. You stayed up too late. Fine. Repair tonight. This kind of self-talk lacks drama, which is exactly why it works. Drama often serves the ego by making small failures feel grand. Quiet correction serves your life by making recovery immediate. It also helps to understand that your attention is shaped by what you repeatedly admire. If you constantly watch people performing urgency, outrage, luxury, speed, and endless novelty, your own life begins to look painfully slow by comparison. But if you expose yourself more often to examples of patience, craft, steadiness, depth, and actual concentration, your standards shift. You become less impressed by noise. You become less hungry for spectacle. What you admire enters you. Be careful what kind of energy you normalize through repeated exposure. You do not have to copy someone else's lifestyle exactly, but you should notice whether the things you consume strengthen your capacity for life or weaken it. A disciplined life is not a life of constant effort. It is a life in which effort is directed and recovery is real. That distinction matters because many people unconsciously create false choices. Either I stay chaotic and comfortable, or I become rigid and miserable. Either I scroll and feel alive, or I become boring. Either I keep my freedoms, or I become a robot. But these are caricatures. The actual choice is often between compulsive pleasure that leaves you emptier and chosen structure that makes deeper pleasure possible. The person who can focus is not missing out on life. They are entering it more fully. The person who can tolerate silence is not deprived. They are available. The person who can work without constant escape is not a machine. They are free in a way addiction can barely understand. If you want a simple test of where you stand, try doing one ordinary thing with total presence. Eat one meal without a screen. Read 10 pages without checking anything. Walk for 20 minutes without audio. Sit down for 30 focused minutes and let the discomfort come and go without obeying it. Then notice your mind. Notice how quickly it bargains, how often it reaches, how urgently it wants a second layer of stimulation. Notice also the relief that follows if you stay long enough. Not a thrilling relief, but a clean one. The relief of no longer being split. The relief of not having to constantly decide. The relief of inhabiting one experience at a time. That clean relief is easy to underestimate because it does not shout. but it is one of the foundations of peace. Peace, in the end, is not just the absence of stress. It is the absence of inner scattering. A person can be busy and peaceful if their attention is gathered. Another can be seemingly free and deeply agitated because their mind is always lunging toward the next hit. When you reclaim your attention, you reclaim the possibility of peace, even in an imperfect life. Problems do not vanish. Work remains work. Grief remains grief. Responsibility remains heavy at times, but you are no longer carrying the extra tax of constant fragmentation. You can meet reality more directly, and direct meeting is often easier than endless avoidance, even when reality is difficult. Perhaps the most painful myth to release is the idea that someday you will wake up and simply want the right things enough for discipline to become effortless. Desire matters, yes. Vision matters, yes. But the human being is more complicated than that. You can want a better life sincerely and still be ruled by shorter impulses. You can understand the truth deeply and still act against it tomorrow morning. This does not make you fake. It makes you trainable. Your actions are not the final verdict on your values. They are the current result of your conditioning, environment, and practiced responses. That is sobering because it means wishing is not enough. It is hopeful because practiced responses can change. Change begins with a strange form of humility. You stop demanding that every action feel grand. You stop waiting for a dramatic before and after story. You stop needing the day to validate your identity instantly. Instead, you ask quieter questions. What would reduce friction toward the right thing right now? What boundary would protect my attention this evening? What promise is small enough that I can keep it even in a low mood? What input is making me feel scattered? What unfinished thing is haunting me? What am I using stimulation to avoid feeling? These are not glamorous questions, but they are effective because they meet the problem where it actually lives, in lived moments, not abstract dreams. There is tremendous dignity in becoming a person who can do the next honest thing. Not the biggest thing, not the most optimized thing. The next honest thing. Close the extra tabs. Put the phone away. Finish the paragraph. Answer the message. Stretch the body. Drink the water. Go outside. Tell the truth. End the night earlier. Return to the work. An honest thing is one that your deeper self already knows matters, even if no one else sees it. A life rebuilt from honest things may look unimpressive to a culture addicted to display, but it creates a kind of confidence that display cannot imitate. The confidence of congruence, the quiet relief of being less divided. You might think your problem is that you lack discipline, but perhaps the more precise statement is this. Your life has trained you into constant reaction, and reaction is consuming the energy that discipline needs. That is a different problem. It suggests different solutions. Not more guilt, but more design. Not more hype, but more repetition. Not more self-accusation, but more contact. If you build a life in which your attention is endlessly harvested, do not be shocked when purpose feels faint. Purpose grows in protected ground. It needs room to hold still long enough for meaning to accumulate. The deepest work in your life will almost always ask for less noise than the world wants you to tolerate. This is why reclaiming focus is never just about getting more done. It is about deciding what kind of consciousness you want to live inside. Do you want a mind that is constantly pulled outward by every flash of possibility? Or do you want a mind that can remain with what matters long enough for love, craft, and clarity to deepen? Do you want to spend your best years in microscopic negotiations with distraction? Or do you want to know what your life feels like when your attention belongs to you more often than not? These questions are not abstract. They are being answered every day by how you wake, how you pause, how you work, how you avoid, how you return. And yes, there is a kind of grief in realizing how much of your life has been shaped by the trap. Grief for hours lost, for books unread, for conversations half-lived, for talents underused, for dreams repeatedly delayed by 1,000 small escapes. Let the grief teach you, but do not let it paralyze you. The purpose of seeing clearly is not self-punishment, it is liberation. The moment you understand the mechanism, you stop worshiping the symptom. You stop calling yourself broken when the pattern is learned. You stop mistaking shame for seriousness. You stop expecting the world of stimulation to deliver the peace it has been taking from you. Then something quieter and stronger can begin. You stop trying to feel transformed and start becoming dependable. You stop chasing the fantasy of total reinvention and start building a trustworthy day. You stop asking how to become a disciplined person in theory and start proving in tiny visible moments that your attention can be placed on purpose, a kept promise here, a protected hour there, a calmer evening, a morning not surrendered, a task finished, a boundary held, a relapse interrupted, a walk taken without a soundtrack, a conversation given full presence. Piece by piece, the evidence accumulates, and evidence is what changes identity, not slogans, not moods, not declarations made in the glow of inspiration. Evidence. Once you have enough evidence, the inner relationship changes. You no longer hear your own intentions as empty theater. When you say, "I will begin," a part of you believes it. When you say "not now" to a craving, you know from experience that the feeling will pass. When you feel resistance, you no longer interpret it as doom. You recognize it as weather. Difficult weather sometimes, but still weather. This is a profound freedom. The world may remain noisy, seductive, and fragmented, but you are no longer as easily purchased by every small reward. You have discovered something more stabilizing than motivation. Trust in your capacity to return. Trust in your capacity to return may be the real antidote to the dopamine trap, because the trap survives on the belief that one lapse ruins everything, that one urge must be obeyed, that one hard feeling requires immediate relief, that one distracted day proves you are still the same person. Return breaks that mythology. Return says I can be imperfect without disappearing. Return says I can feel the craving and remain. Return says I can lose the thread and pick it up again. Return says I am not measured only by what pulls me away, but by what I repeatedly come back to. This is how a fragmented life becomes whole again, not through purity, through repeated homecoming. Homecoming is not loud. It may happen in a dim room with a phone turned face down. It may happen at a desk where you finally stop bargaining and write the first honest sentence. It may happen on a walk when you notice the evening air because you are not trying to escape your own company. It may happen at midnight when you decide not to spiral further and simply go to sleep. It may happen in the middle of an urge when you feel your hand move, then stop, then breathe, then stay. These moments rarely look dramatic from the outside, yet they are the building blocks of a reclaimed life. Each one says, "My attention is not for sale at every price." If you remember nothing else, remember this. You are not lazy because modern stimulation has made depth feel difficult. You are not doomed because your focus has weakened. You are not fraudulent because your habits do not yet match your hopes. You are living in a world that fragments attention and rewards compulsion, and you have been shaped by it. But shaping is not destiny. A nervous system can heal. A mind can become less hungry for noise. A person can learn to begin before desire catches up. A scattered life can become coherent through repeated acts of protection, contact, and return. The work is real. The resistance is real. But so is the recovery. So the next time you feel the old pull, the urge to check, escape, postpone, drift, pause long enough to ask a better question. Not what do I feel like doing right now. Not how do I remove this discomfort instantly. Ask instead, what would it look like to take my mind back in this moment? Maybe the answer is tiny. Maybe it is simply to remain seated. Maybe it is to close one app. Maybe it is to finish one page. Maybe it is to walk into the next room and leave the device behind. Maybe it is to accept that starting feels bad for 5 minutes and do it anyway. Small answers, honestly repeated, build large lives. That is the path out. Not a miracle. Not a mood. Not a perfectly optimized identity imported from somebody else's highlight reel. The path out is 1,000 small moments in which you refuse to abandon yourself just because discomfort appeared. It is the slow return of taste for ordinary reality. It is the rebuilding of trust between your values and your actions. It is the discovery that discipline is not a punishment, but a way of making freedom possible again. And once you taste that freedom, even briefly, even imperfectly, you begin to understand that what you were craving all along was never more stimulation. It was ownership. Ownership of attention. Ownership of attention. Ownership of your own interior life. And from that ownership, a real future can finally begin. You will know the old world is losing its grip when simple things stop feeling like punishments. You wash dishes and notice the warm water. Instead of reaching for entertainment, you answer one difficult message without needing 10 easier ones first. You sit in a room and discover that not every silence is empty. You look at the task you have delayed for days and realize it has become smaller than the story you built around it. This does not happen because life suddenly got easy. It happens because your relationship to effort changed. The first few minutes of resistance no longer carry absolute authority. You have learned that discomfort can be temporary, that boredom can open into depth, that the itch to escape can pass if you stop treating it like an emergency. The reward is not only productivity, the reward is steadiness, a steadier inner climate, a steadier pace of thought, a steadier way of moving through a world trying very hard to make you unstable. Steadiness is deeply underrated because it lacks the glamour of intensity. It will not usually produce a dramatic montage. It does not feel as exciting as a huge breakthrough, a wild sprint of motivation, or a night of grand plans made under the influence of inspiration. But intensity is a poor parent for a meaningful life. Intensity can begin things. It rarely carries them. Steadiness carries them. The person who can return to the same worthwhile effort, even with imperfect energy, builds something most people envy and misname as talent. What they are often seeing is accumulated steadiness, paragraph by paragraph, workout by workout, boundary by boundary, one invisible choice at a time. If you are tired of living in bursts, then what you need is not a stronger burst. You need a structure that honors steadiness enough to protect it from your own swings. That means learning the art of reducing drama around necessary things. You do not need to reinvent your identity every time you sit down to work. You do not need to debate the meaning of your whole life before you start the first task. You do not need to forecast the entire future before cleaning the room, sending the application, reading the chapter, or going outside. One reason distraction feels so powerful is that it arrives in simple language. Check this, watch this, click here, scroll a little. It speaks in immediate actions. Meanwhile, the deeper life often gets translated into oversized moral pressure. Fix yourself. Catch up. Become exceptional. Solve everything. No wonder the nervous system flees. You can counter this by speaking to yourself more concretely. Open the file. Write badly for 10 minutes. Put the laundry away. Stretch your back. Turn the device off and place it in the other room. Simplicity defeats a lot of chaos. There is wisdom in becoming boring in strategic ways. boring to the impulses that once controlled you, boring to the app that expects your reflex, boring to the habit that wants instant obedience, boring to the fantasy that your life should always feel cinematic. A great deal of freedom comes from refusing to be endlessly impressed by whatever screams loudest. You start noticing how much manipulation depends on your appetite for novelty. Headlines are sharpened for it. Platforms are engineered for it. Advice is packaged for it. Even your own mind learns to perform for it, constantly searching for a more stimulating interpretation of what should happen next. When you become less seducible by novelty, you become harder to move off center. This does not make you dull. It makes you less easy to command. Being less easy to command is one of the rarest forms of modern wealth, not because it makes you superior, but because it returns your energy to you. People talk about time management as if time were the only thing being stolen. But attention is the more intimate currency. You can lose an hour and recover. You can lose your attentional character and wake up one day inside a life you barely chose. That is why it matters what repeatedly interrupts you. Not every interruption is equal. Some are necessary, loving, and human. Others are ambient theft, small enough to seem harmless and frequent enough to change you. Each unnecessary interruption teaches the mind to expect fracture. Each protected interval teaches it that continuity still exists. You become what your days rehearse. If your days rehearsed interruption, you will think in fragments. If your days rehearse continuity, your mind begins to trust depth again. Depth is where meaning gathers. Surface can entertain you, inform you, even inspire you for a moment. But depth is where things begin to alter you. A book changes you in depth. An honest conversation changes you in depth. A stretch of undistracted work changes you in depth. A long walk where a tangled thought finally unties itself changes you in depth. The trap is dangerous because it keeps you skimming your own life. You touch 10 things and inhabit none of them fully. You become familiar with the outline of many experiences while remaining hungry in the center. Then you make the mistake of thinking you need even more input, when what you actually need is one thing entered deeply enough to satisfy. Many cravings are really failed attempts at depth. This is also why overthinking and overstimulation often travel together. A scattered mind is not always an empty mind. Sometimes it is flooded. Thoughts keep arriving, but because you rarely stay still long enough to sort them, they pile into each other. The result feels like mental complexity, but a lot of it is just unprocessed noise. You revisit the same concerns because you never sit with them cleanly. You keep searching for the perfect answer because your inner world is too agitated to hear the obvious one. You call yourself an overthinker when, in some areas, you may actually be underprocessing. Thinking is not the same as circling. Thought moves. Circling repeats. Thought clarifies. Circling agitates. Thought eventually produces a next step. Circling becomes a substitute for one. When stimulation is excessive, the mind loses its appetite for resolution and becomes attached to constant churn. Resolution often begins with making smaller decisions faster, not impulsively, but cleanly. The longer a simple decision stays open, the more likely it is to become emotionally inflated. Should I start now? Should I go? Should I text back? Should I clean this? Should I read tonight? Should I stop scrolling and sleep? Open loops multiply tension. Tension increases the appeal of escape. Escape creates more loops. This is why some people feel suffocated not by their workload, but by their indecision. They are carrying the weight of 500 tiny, unfinished conversations with themselves. Close a few. Choose. Begin. End. Put away. Delete. Answer. Decline. Commit. The mind breathes easier when it does not have to keep rehearsing the same unresolved question all day. Another sign of healing is when your self-respect stops depending entirely on achievement. In the trap, worth swings wildly. If you had a productive day, you feel temporarily redeemable. If you avoided, you feel vaguely disgusted with yourself. That is unstable. It makes work emotionally dangerous because every session becomes a referendum on your value. No wonder you resist beginning. But when self-respect starts to root itself in honesty, courage, and return, the emotional burden shifts. A hard day does not crown you. A bad day does not erase you. What matters more is whether you stayed sincere, whether you corrected course, whether you met reality without theatrical excuses. This creates a calmer foundation for discipline. You can work because work matters, not because today's output will determine whether you deserve peace. Peace also comes from learning that rest must be earned in the right currency, not through exhaustion alone and not through guilt either. Many people try to rest while still internally in debt to themselves. Tasks are floating, promises are broken, the day feels vaguely wasted, yet they ask entertainment to produce restoration. Usually it cannot. It may distract, but it does not settle the account. Rest becomes cleaner when at least some honest effort has been made. Not perfect effort, honest effort. Enough to let the nervous system unclench because it knows you did not fully abandon the day. This is why even a modest evening work session can feel better than endless drifting. The body senses integrity. The mind senses closure. Then rest is more available. You do not have to solve everything by force. In fact, a lot of progress comes from noticing where force keeps failing and replacing it with design. If you always lose the first hour of the morning, then the problem is not abstract weakness. It is the shape of the morning. If you always scroll in bed, then the problem is not insufficient wisdom. It is the bedtime environment and the unguarded transition into sleep. If you cannot focus after lunch, maybe the issue is not destiny, but the lack of a defined restart ritual. Design is compassionate because it does not require you to win every battle through sheer will. It asks a better question: how can this life become easier to live well? The answer may be practical, almost embarrassingly so. Another room, a timer, a blocked site, a written cue. A later bedtime alarm, a shorter task window, a visible notebook, a simpler desk. Do not underestimate the holiness of practical solutions. There will be moments when you miss the chaos. That may surprise you, but chaos can feel familiar, vivid, even intimate. It gives you drama. It gives you excuses. It gives you the strange comfort of saying, "This is just how I am." A calmer life asks more of you in another direction. It asks you to face the fact that when the noise drops, choice becomes clearer. And clear choice can feel heavy because it reveals agency. If I am not entirely at the mercy of the trap, then what am I going to do with my life? If distraction is no longer my full identity, then what matters enough for me to protect? Freedom is beautiful, but it also removes certain alibis. This is one reason some people unconsciously sabotage recovery. The trap is painful, yes, but it is also explanatory. Leaving it means stepping into a wider field of responsibility. Yet that wider field is where adult life really begins. Not adult life as performance, but adult life as authorship. You stop treating your moods like kings. You stop treating convenience like truth. You stop assuming that the easiest impulse is the most authentic one. You begin to recognize that freedom is not found in obeying every desire, but in being able to choose which desires deserve your loyalty. The person who cannot resist every passing urge is not more free because they have more options in the moment. They are less free because the options choose them. Freedom matures when values become operational, when they move from admiration to schedule, from preference to boundary, from wish to repeated act. Repeated act is what builds a life sturdy enough to hold ambition without breaking under it. Ambition itself is not the enemy. In fact, part of your suffering may come from the fact that you want a real life and keep feeling yourself drift away from it. That tension hurts because the desire is genuine. Protect that desire. Do not let repeated distraction convince you that you never cared. The pain you feel is evidence that some deeper part of you is still intact. It still wants honesty. It still wants contribution. It still wants to use your days for something worthy. Your job is not to manufacture that part. Your job is to stop drowning it. Give it conditions in which it can speak louder than craving. Then listen when it asks for modest, difficult, beautiful things. Those beautiful things may not look beautiful at first. They may look like going to bed while the old self still wants one more hour of nothing. They may look like finishing a task before allowing reward. They may look like sitting through boredom until it turns into concentration. They may look like leaving a conversation with your phone untouched in your pocket. They may look like feeling lonely and choosing to call a real person instead of vanishing into anonymous stimulation. They may look like accepting that growth is repetitive. But repetition is not the enemy when it is aligned. Repetition is how musicians become fluent, how athletes become precise, how writers become clear, how minds become trustworthy. What matters is what you repeat. In the end, the strongest argument for taking your mind back is not that you will become more efficient. It is that you will become more alive, more able to notice, more able to commit, more able to love what is in front of you without needing constant enhancement, more able to bear the first rough minutes of effort until they soften into flow, more able to hear your own conscience without drowning it in noise, more able to distinguish comfort from nourishment, more able to move through an ordinary day with a sense that you are actually there for it. There is a kind of miracle in that, not the miracle of becoming superhuman, the miracle of becoming present enough that your real life can finally make contact with you. And when that contact deepens, the future stops feeling like a fantasy estate you may someday visit if you become perfect enough. It starts feeling like something built in the present tense. Here, tonight, this pause, this refusal, this return, this hour protected from chaos, this small promise kept while no one is watching. The future begins there, in the quality of your attention now, not later when everything is fixed, now when the old impulse rises and you answer differently. Now when you choose depth over the reflex to escape. Now when you let one unglamorous act of discipline stand where an entire identity speech used to be. That is how the trap weakens. That is how a human being takes their mind back. And that is how an ordinary life, patiently reclaimed, becomes something powerful enough to feel like freedom.